letting me go on to my alternative stations, but those are less important. The important one is YouTube, and that I record everything. So let me just do that. You know, one of the reasons why I now have about 10 different live stream venues and about 20 different audio and video archive venues, all listed, by the way, on my new website, charlesmoscowitz.com, is that way. And when they shut me down on one, I'm still up on the other.
You'll still be up on another, yeah.
And I'm building them all, and it's kind of like a game of chicken, you know, like which one's going to be up and which one ain't.
Yeah.
So here we are, Hal. We're talking about your lawsuit that may reach the Supreme Court regarding religious freedom and political freedom in terms of running a flag up at Boston City Hall. I don't actually right now have a lot of faith in the Supreme Court, given the fact that they ignored black and white constitutional language, Article 2, Section 2, with regard to the sole prerogative of state legislators to regulate election law.
Yes.
They decided to ignore that. Apparently that this wasn't even something that, you know, would be seen as ambiguous. I mean, this is pure constitutional language, and they ignored that, you know, including the new Justice Barrett, who's been a real disappointment and an empty suit. So, yeah.
Yeah, we're not sure how we'll end up, but I think I think in many respects we've won, because we've demonstrated very clearly that the city of Boston is hostile to people of faith that are, and they are sympathetic to far leftists like Communist China. What they're saying is that putting a flag on this city-owned, but I call public access flagpole, is official government speech. And they don't approve of the flag, but they approve of the flags of Communist China, Communist Cuba, rainbow flags, transgender flags, and other nations. In fact, it's actually illegal to fly a foreign flag on city, state, municipal property in Massachusetts. It's like a $10 fine, unless there's a foreign dignitary that's there in official capacity. That's the only exception. Mm-hmm. Now, the city of Boston flew the Vatican flag when Pope John Paul II visited, and that was before we officially recognized them as a country. You know, diplomatic relations.
Last I checked, the Vatican flag does have a cross on it too.
Yes, and by the way, I have no trouble with the Vatican flag or the Star of David being flown. If a legitimate organization wants to have a ceremony and use City Hall Plaza and nobody else is using it. And some people on the conservative side got upset. Well, what if the Muslims use it? What if this group? I says, well, they already do. They fly the Turkish flag with the crescent on there.
That's right.
I said, then why don't your organization use it? That's all. I mean, you should have every right. But the city actually changed its rules now, so they gave themselves more discretion. But they didn't change it until after the case.
Typical.
Yeah.
So now, Hal, we see this viral video that I really urge people to see. A Catholic priest, I believe from Canada.
No, he's not a priest. He's a pastor. Pastor. Yeah.
Okay.
His name is Artur Podlowski, Calgary.
Right, a good Polish pastor from Calgary, Alberta, which it doesn't matter. It could be the United States. We're talking about North America here. He has an incursion by these black-clad, police in the middle of his Easter Sunday services, coming in and interrupting the service and trying to disband the service under the guise of, something to do maybe with masks or something else. And he starts to scream, "Get out, get out." It's the most incredible thing. Out, you Gestapo. He says, "You're a bunch of Nazi psychopaths.
Nazis aren't welcome there," he said. "Get out,
no Nazis. Get out." Don't forget Poland.
Psychopaths.
Poland had to undergo the occupation by the Nazis and then by the communists right up until 1989. And so he probably knows what he's talking about. It sounds like he had an accent. He sounds like somebody who's been there. And it was one of the...
Yeah. He's in his late 40s. He grew up in a communist regime, and he did call them communists too. But I think it's a good strategy to use the word Nazi, because when you call a leftist a communist, they say thank you because they like communism. But if you call them a Nazi, they get upset. So you have to sometimes use language, to I think to make a point. But his parents grew up during the Nazi occupation and then the communist occupation, and he said that he was witness to the solidarity movement and how the communists would arbitrarily beat people pretty senseless. So we had enough, and there's been a number of churches around the country and maybe even around the world that have said no. Not many. They're in the small minority. In Massachusetts, there was one in Worcester, Little Baptist Church. I met the pastor. I think it's Tim Adams. And he actually was using all the protocols. They had the masks. They had all types. They bought some expensive air filters, and they still arrested the guy. So you just have to stand up to these bullies. A church, a place of worship, is essential in any time, especially during a pandemic. Instead, they were shut down. This was the CDC and the WHO, World Health Organization, we know is an arm of the UN, automatically discredited, but it's been influenced very strongly by the communist Chinese. The man who runs it, I forget his name, he's the Ethiopian Marxist. So right. Marxists are telling people, capitalist countries, free market countries, to shut down your economy to prevent a virus which the Chinese communists deliberately spread. That, I think, is pretty clear. And it's ironic, too. You can say the South African strain, the Indian strain, this strain, but you can't say the Chinese, because that's supposed to be racism. And I guess that's another topic.
Hal, let's be careful, because, again, this is YouTube. And there are certain things we cannot talk about because I'll be purged. And one of them, and I'll just say it in a very broad sense, is this most recent presidential election. We cannot say anything about it other than that it was, pure and wonderful. And, you can talk about any other election. We could talk about the 1960 election, but you can't talk about the 2020 election.
It's an Orwellian world, isn't it?
It is. Although, ultimately, they're not going to win. But, for now, we're living in a fascistic system where we really have limitations on a lot of levels of freedom, not just freedom of speech, but also freedom to worship. And I would hope that this pastor will serve as an inspiration to all pastors and to all people. I don't think that my own rabbi will be much inspired, because we're talking about the most masked people in America there. We're talking about people completely subservient. They're servile. But I would wonder if this happened in my synagogue on the Sabbath and I was there, I would stand up and say, "Get out, I'm not leaving. You'll have to take me away." I wonder how many people would stand with me. I have a feeling probably very few.
Very few, yeah. Well, I used to live in Massachusetts, born and raised, and lived in Boston all my life, except my time in the military. But I'm now in the free state of New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire is not a paradise, but it's a whole lot better than Massachusetts, especially with this mandated nonsense. I'm in Lexington, Massachusetts, on a regular basis, and that's an upper middle class, wealthy, predominantly white area. And they wear no mask everywhere. Little children are wearing them. People are walking all by themselves, wearing the mask. They're driving in their cars.
They're walking in the middle of nowhere. They're walking in a field with a friggin' mask.
And I see that, and those people scare me. Not physically, it's the ignorance. I said, so many of these people. That's what troubles me. The ignorance. And when I see a person driving in a vehicle with a mask on, and unless they've got some kind of existing condition, which most of them don't, I don't want to even talk to those people. By the way, there's a great YouTube channel called Media Bear, and they do all these spoofs on this mask mandate stuff. And they have one, I wear my mask when I drive. It's I wear my sunglasses at night. The song, it came out in the 80s. So I check it out. It's funny. You need to have a good laugh because of these crazy times.
Man, and it's getting testier out there too. I've noticed that. I had a situation actually myself where, I was actually having lunch, and you're allowed to take the mask off with lunch if you're in a place, and it wasn't that many people there. And so as I was getting up to leave, I forgot to put it on. And we're talking about a very quick walk from the table to the door. And this guy standing in behind the counter started yelling at me. And, I always could tell that these people were kind of they're Trump haters. Okay, let's just put it that way. This kind of mean, surly, dour, negative, lifeless attitude. And I just said, fine, I'm never coming back here again.
Good for you.
No, it's like,
Good for you.
great, you just lost a customer, and I'll tell other people too. I put a pox on your house. Because, look, I mean, it would have been fine if he might have been polite about it and said, listen, you forgot your mask. Okay, but no, he was like, just, put a mask on. We're talking to me like I'm.
And the fascinating thing is, most people may remember Fauci. Should I say Lord Fauci has he been knighted by the Queen? I don't know, but But Lord Fauci, back in March of last year, said that there's no need to wear the masks. He said you might stop a droplet or two. And then a few months later, May, in the height of the virus, the height of the pandemic, all of a sudden states had adopted all these mask mandates. All these governors, no law was passed. And I never forget going into a bank and seeing the sign that you must have a mask. And I said, if I wore a mask prior to this thing, I'd be arrested.
Yes, exactly.
No, wear a mask. And, I was in the Army, and everybody in the Army, I guess they still do it. We go into a gas chamber where we have our gas mask. And you have to have a seal or that mask is useless. And then we're supposed to take them off and then, recite our name and rank and serial number. And then we run out, and I couldn't get past my first name, and I ran out of there. But you respect the seal of a mask. Now, I actually bought one at a yard sale, one of these, I forget what they call it, but there was the same type of mask that I wore. And this mask is good for nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare. If there was a nuclear explosion, if I was with so many from 0.0, it would be good for about 15 minutes. That mask does not stop the coronavirus because of its size. But that mask, that gas mask, is about 100,000 times, or maybe in 1,000,000 times more effective than that little piece of cloth that people are wearing on their face. There's no seal on these things. And so you're going to get them. I heard someone say it's like putting a chain link fence up to stop keeping flies out. It's useless. But people are so convinced. They probably have no experience with these things, and even if they did work, you see people fidgeting, and you're not supposed to wear a mask all day, every day.
It's actually unhealthy. But having said that, Hal, I just want to throw in, for the sake of the censors, that I'm neither condoning nor condemning the wearing of masks. That is up to individuals. I have no comment. Now, 1 month ago or 3 weeks ago, the governor of Texas, Abbott, declared that the mandates were over. There will be no more mask mandates. There'll be no more lockdown. He didn't say not to wear it. He said that that's up to individual discretion. It's up to a business to decide what their policies would be. And Fauci, speaking of St. Fauci, came out and said, there's just tapes of this. There's going to be a surge. There's going to be hospitalization. There's going to be another huge disaster. And of course, Biden or whoever his people who put stuff in his head are, they came out with a statement saying that that this was a Neanderthal. I think he referred to the state of Texas. Well, 3 weeks later, and Texas the rates are dropping in Texas. They're going up in New York,
right,
New Jersey, and California, and some of the other leftist states, Michigan. But in Texas,
by the way, Chuck, I'm in solidarity with the Neanderthal community.
Me too.
I'm right there with them. I don't like this hatred of Neanderthals. It's terrible.
Really, and plus we're proud deplorables too.
That's right.
But anyway, the thing is that he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. I mean, and this is with illegals coming over the border, and still the numbers in Texas are dropping. So, what do we make of that? I mean, this is a situation where it makes me wonder whether or not they're ever going to stop these mandates and they're ever going to stop these lockdowns. I think this is an opinion, but I think that this is such an incredible and toxic and addictive power for government that they're not going to relinquish it so quickly. It's going to come back and forth, but they ain't never going to let go.
Well, Chuck, you and I have studied how the elites work, and you've done a lot of work exposing it ever since I first met you way back in the early 90s. I never thought they would use the crises of a disease to consolidate power. And, I've done a lot of work with Agenda 20, exposing Agenda 21, that UN program.
Yeah.
And people say, what's that? It's just a Green New Deal. And I have to thank AOC for at least, making so. But now when people say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. Well, no, it's the Green New Deal is something that she didn't write it up. It was done for her. But that's what the Green New Deal is. But shutting down baseball parks and movie theaters and Broadway shows and restricting this and restricting that reduces the carbon footprint, right? So this is a big boon for those people. They love it. And you're right. Once government takes power, they don't give it back without the people getting it back. So it's something that, and of course, I think we know if it wasn't for this COVID, Trump would be in the White House still. He would have won.
Oh, well, let's not go there because we'll be banned.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Everyone watching this program knows what we're talking about here. Okay. We have to kind of work with the censors and with the, and I'm serious about that. I'm having on later today, I'm having Doug TenNapel on. I don't know if you know who he is, but
no.
He did a very good and responsible job of discussing this past election in terms that are very reasonable and well-backed and statistical. And he's been purged from YouTube.
Wow.
And he's not particularly a man of the right or the left. I mean, he was just doing a straight arrow analysis. Anyway, now I want to ask you about something here, because George Gilder is one of America's most respected philosophers and intellectuals. He spent 3 years in China, I believe, in the Bush administration as part of the embassy there. And recently he's written a book and he's been warning about, and he did so long before we all know this, how China is using big technology to monitor their own citizens to a degree that's been unprecedented. And that he was convinced that they're going to he's going to get Google and all these other guys to basically implement that same system into the United States. And in China, you have what's called social scores.
That's right.
And, because everybody carries a smartphone, and most people do, and it keeps track of you. It knows where you are, what you're thinking about, what you're doing, what you're saying. It's spying on you. And if your social score, if you're seen as somehow not politically correct and you have a low social score, you don't have certain rights. I mean, you can't go certain places. You can't, maybe they could control whether or not you could buy food. I don't know, or whatever it is. And, if you have a higher social score, then you're probably a party member and you're fine. Well, apparently, I mean, and this is according to, and this is something that Jeff Kuhner is talking about. At WRKO, and he's a great source.
In Boston, yes.
In Boston. This is not some nutty thing. I mean, this is a major radio station in Boston, big station. That the reason why we're seeing companies like Coca-Cola and Delta and Home Depot and others suddenly decide to do things that have no rationality, like boycott Atlanta and shut down the All-Star game because of some leftist agenda, is because these social scores are being implemented here. They call it ESG. E stands for environment, S stands for social justice or socialism, and G stands for governance. And they're rating businesses, both big and small, on their ESG levels. And if they fall below a certain threshold on any one of those three levels, then they don't have the kind of social scores that you need. So therefore, they're doing stuff that goose steps to the leftist agenda because that's the S, right? The social, so-called social justice. So this is why you're seeing companies do these irrational things. I mean, this, boycotting Atlanta, which is, by the way, a predominantly black city. So that's
correct.
Predominantly
white city. By the way, Fulton County, which is where Atlanta is, voted for Biden 70%. So that's a pretty wide margin. And how are they rewarded? they're moving it to Denver, which is 10% black, named after Adolf Kors, which was, back in I remember the 80s and 90s, they were
the enemy of the left. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was a right-wing John Birch meanie,
Oh,
They
sure.
went after him pretty nasty. The Coors company, conservatively owned, conservative family. It's
right.
just, you just shake your head and say, and it was bad enough back last summer with the Black Lives Matter. All these baseball parks are all kneeling down with the clenched fist. We know what the clenched fist, we know the history of the clenched fist. It's got nothing to do with black struggle, a communist clenched fist.
Of course.
And they were putting it on the fields, and maybe one or two players here and there said no. Most of them were people of faith that said no. I only kneel to when I pray. I don't kneel down to man. And those people were treated pretty badly in most cases. People lost their jobs over it. And then you just say, well, why would? Yes, of course we Black Lives Matter. In fact, you should get there's a guy by the name of Kevin McGarry. His group is Every Black Life Matters. And it's a pro-family, pro-Christian alternative to Black Lives Matter. And because the Black Lives Matter group, as you know, they don't care about blacks that are being killed by other blacks. They don't care about black policemen getting killed. They don't care about black babies being aborted in New York. For example, as you know, there are more black babies aborted in New York City than are born. They only seem to care about blacks who, most of them criminals who are getting in trouble with the police. Those are the only ones they really speak out for.
Well, yeah. And also this agenda, by the way, in Georgia, which is predictable, is basically that finally, too late for the last
right, too late.
But finally, the state legislators are beginning to reassert their governmental responsibility, their constitutional responsibility as representatives of the people of those states to regulate election and to ensure that we preserve the concept of one man, one vote, that therefore there's no voter suppression, because voter suppression happens when a real vote, a legitimate vote, whether that vote is cast by a black or a white person, is suppressed when a fake vote is cast.
That's right.
That's what it is. And so they're trying to prevent voter suppression by ensuring that what happened the last couple of months, like fake ballots flooding into the state from out of state, and dead people voting, and electronic fraud, and I'm sorry to use that word, but all these other things that happened, particularly in Georgia, was one of the worst, that it doesn't happen again. And therefore, we're being told that by doing this, somehow they've got something against black people, when in fact, this whole premise is a form of racism that goes back to like a kind of an imperial British, white man's burden thing. It's like, Rudyard Kipling,
Right.
Greater man than I, Gunga Din. I mean, this idea that the black person is not able or capable of registering to vote just like anyone else, and that they should be treated like children, that there's nothing to do with that. First of all, the insulting and offensive element of that portrayal of black people as if they're not just as capable as white people to register to vote.
I want to quote Malcolm X, not that I was a fan of his, but in his autobiography, he said that white liberals spelled Negro, and the term Negro was accepted back. It was a generic, it wasn't insulting. He said white liberals spelled Negro, K-N-E-E-G-R-O-W, meaning basically this condescending type of racism. Oh, we know what's best for you. Please support us. If you don't vote for me, you're not black, that type of thing. Right. We know what we feel, and when they really don't, they have the white left has done very little to help the black community whatsoever.
The black community, and the black community looks at them with scorn. There's an expression in the black community for them. They call them the white saviors.
White saviors, yeah.
And of course, you and I could talk about the terrible destruction the left has done to the American black community starting in the 1960s with welfare, with the destruction of the black church, with
the family,
crime, poverty, anti-business, all of it. I mean, it's so we can talk about who's really the racist here.
Well, Chuck, our late friend Sam Blumenfeld, he did and we've archived a lot of his writings on our website, the Samuel Blumenfeld, campconstitution.net. He dedicated one of his newsletters, and it's still today. It was written, I think, in June of 1987 or June of 1986. You can find it on our website. It said that eugenics and the creation of a permanent Black underclass. And he just mentioned that the Black community made so many advancements from 1865, when a good portion of them were enslaved, up until 1965, 1980, 86. They had schools, they had churches, they had a number of professional people, and then they introduced this look-say method, this eugenics movement with the Planned Parenthood. And when you see these angry people burning things down, in fact, we are on our Podomatic page where you are.
Yeah.
We posted a 5-minute speech. He was being interviewed about the LA riots, and he said, "I'm blaming it in part on the illiteracy in the Black community." He says people have no hope. They have no ability to go anywhere economically. So they're angry, and this is how they release their anger. And so I reposted it because I think you can say the same thing today. That what was true in 1992 is true today in 2021.
Oh, yeah. Well, Sam was a prophet. I mean, I hope people go to Sam's page. A lot of his programming that I did with him is archived on my Podomatic site as well. Sam and I did probably hundreds of hours together doing broadcasting. Some of the greatest moments for me was having him on, and his insights were incredible. And, I wish he was here today to see, frankly, the great opportunities for homeschooling, right, with the pandemic.
Well, there's always a positive. There's always what they call a silver lining in the cloud.
Yeah.
Because when they locked all the public schools down, you call it remote learning. Well, it was homeschooling, although not traditional homeschooling.
Right.
And the homeschool movement has blossomed. And not just because of the virus, but also the content of what's being taught in these schools. This crazy 1619 curriculum. The 1619 curriculum is really incubating more Antifa and more anti-American terrorists. That's what that's about.
Oh, it's a movement. It's an agenda of hate and division, and the whole critical race theory and all of that garbage. It is tyrannical. It is to be rejected. I mean, it's a vicious and hateful view of American history, American culture. Comes from the influence of, I think, Howard Zinn and people's history of the United States. I remember I interviewed Howard Zinn. I wish I had a tape of that, the late Howard Zinn. He was just this arrogant, hostile. He had all the affectations of a leftist too, with the facial tics and the groans and did all of it. I mean, he personified that. He's poisoned the minds and the souls of more young people in this country than I think anyone in the past half a century.
Chuck, there's a great book. It's called Debunking Howard Zinn by Mary Grabar. She's going to be coming to our camp, our family camp this summer in New Hampshire from July 18th to the 23rd. And she's in upstate New York. She's somebody that you should probably have on the show. I interviewed her. She did a great job. And not only that, how I got a hold of her was that she was writing a biography of the late, great George Schuyler. And I think you know who George Schuyler was, the Black journalist that used to write for the American Opinion magazine. Yeah. And so that's how I found about it. And then there's a group called the Italian American Italian American something or Institute, and they became prominent when they ripped down the statue of Columbus in Boston's North End past summer. And I became friendly with the founder, Frank, and he mentioned that book. How Howard Zinn's influence has got a generation of people to hate America, and this absolute lies about Christopher Columbus, just the opposite.
Oh, God. You know something? I want to comment on that briefly. There is a single one-page document that attacked Columbus, and it was written by his enemy and his rival. Right. And I believe that it was sent to Queen Isabella of Spain. And it was that one document where these crazy charges were made that Columbus was a genocidal maniac. And that's all. And anyone who has any basic understanding of how history is to be examined knows that you have to look at that source and look at the motivation of that source and look at it in the context of all of the hundreds of other things that were written at the time, which talked about Columbus as being a great man and something.
That's right.
Different. So they've taken that one little document and they've used that politically to try to undermine and criticize the entire Western Christianization of the New World. I mean, and the development of the culture that we have. And it's not that everything was so perfect, of course. There's no such thing as utopia, but this is a smear job on Columbus. And
Columbus's great crime, Chuck, was that he brought Christianity to this new world. That's why he's hated.
That's right.
But I would hate to have lived under a system where they have human sacrifices, and which they did. And
the Aztecs were among the most brutal society the world had ever seen. I mean, they were so horrible that when Cortez arrived, I mean, he didn't barely have to lift a finger. I mean, everybody rallied around him and got
That's
rid
right.
They got rid of that horrendous regime, and there was a mass conversion to Christianity that had been unlike anything that the world's ever seen. You know, Mexico became the most Christian. I think it's still the most Catholic nation in the world. But bringing things up to Antifa now, the destruction of the Columbus statue, the destruction of and defacement of the Shaw Memorial across from the U.S. Massachusetts State House. This was by the head of the Massachusetts militia who led a predominantly black regiment in the Civil War. I mean,
that's right.
Yeah, and it's they tore down the Lincoln statue.
Well, the Lincoln statue was taken down by the city, and it was a replica of the one that's in Washington, D.C., and it depicts Abraham Lincoln, and it is a slave, and the man who was a model, and the man obviously kind of was agreement, but he wasn't looking at Lincoln as the white man freed me. He was getting off his knees. Now, you can interpret a statue any way you like, but it's what the author or the sculpture had in mind. That's the original interpretation. You can say, for example, you can look at the Shaw Memorial and see a white man on a horse leading black soldiers. Well, it was an all-black unit except for the officers who were white. Shaw actually was a friend of my ancestor who also died in the Civil War. He was a Harvard man. But that was history. Are you trying to say that those black men died in vain? That's what they're trying to say, that somehow you shouldn't even know about that.
Well, it's a communist agenda to erase history altogether. And, exactly. This was an insurrection over the summer where you had gangs of people looting black businesses, burning black neighborhoods, killing black people, including children, in major cities. And it was supported by, fostered by, and nurtured by the predominantly white left-wing media.
And people like Kamala Harris, who was the one of the man that was he was involved in the shooting incident. He survived, but he's handicapped. But this guy was a real lowlife. I mean, the guy had a miserable record. He was abusing children. He was just out of jail. And here's Kamala Harris saying she's proud of him. There's something wrong with that. Something wrong with that woman.
plus my own Congresswoman, Ayanna Pressley, well, we need a few riots. That's what we're going to be getting. I mean,
that's right. Yeah,
we need to do that. This is important. Great.
When she ran for city council, she was in front of the local grocery store in my West Roxbury section. Very attractive looking lady, very personable, and she was a nonpartisan election, and I think I signed it. Yes, sure. So I asked a little bit about her. She worked for Joe Kennedy when he was a U.S. congressman.
Right.
She's from Chicago, and when back in, I think it was 2008, she was 2008 to 2009, she presided over the Chinese Communist flag raising ceremony in Boston. And at that time, she was a city councilor.
Right.
And she runs for Congress. But you know how bad things are in Massachusetts? I hate to say this. I get the New American Magazine, and it has what they call the Freedom Index. It bases members of Congress on their voting record. She's the least leftist of the delegation, the congressional delegation. She's like a 40 where most of them are. Stephen Lynch is like a 10, 10 being to the left of Lenin, and she's about a 40. And I thought, oh my goodness.
Oh man, and there's a couple of new ones that just came in, which make her look like the George Washington.
Jesse Helms.
Oh man. So anyway, but bringing things up. Yeah.
There was a lot of good new candidates. That lady from Georgia, she's fearless. I mean,
yeah. You mean you're talking about Taylor Greene?
No, she went. She's not laying low for the first time. Oh, no. She was there, gangbusters, and that's why they hate her.
Oh my God, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that there's somebody that needs to be denounced, right, and purged. But bringing things up to today, because I want to move into back to the story of what's going on in Georgia. This is a struggle to reassert the right of one man, one vote. That's why they're cooking up this crap about having something against black people. They're using again black people as cannon fodder for their insistence on preserving and indeed codifying voter irregularities. I don't want to use the F word because I'll be banned.
Mm-hmm.
But, we're talking about measures that are put in place to protect the vote. Like, for example, no more, voter harvesting where you have activists going out and gathering up votes and sifting through them and deciding which ones to present. You no longer, there was a case in Georgia where 2 counties wanted to remove the names of people who had either died or had moved out of state from their voter rolls, something that every precinct should do.
Exactly.
Actually. And they were stopped by a federal judge who happens to be the sister of Stacey Abrams.
That's right.
Who has about 28 cases against her organization for out-of-state voters who were not, let's just say they were of questionable nature in terms of who they were. And, we have situations where state secretaries of states and governors have marched in and changed voter rules, which is unconstitutional because only the state legislator has that power.
That's right.
In Michigan, the Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, went in and changed the method of checking signatures for absentee ballots. Now, before that, when you cast an absentee ballot, and by the way, Massachusetts is actually more conservative. You have to have your signature checked, double-checked with the signature on file at the clerk's office to make sure that it really is you. Well, she got rid of that. She said, "Oh no, you don't have to check that any longer. Instead, if it has a faint similarity, then we'll accept it."
Mm-hmm.
And this was done without the approval of the state legislature. The state legislature sued. Of course, it's too late now, but they finally got a state judge, a patriotic state judge, who stood up and read the Constitution and said, "No, you can't do this." Now, I don't think there's been any consequences, but she's now been called to testify at the State House, and she's refusing to go. He says, well, that would be feeding into this conspiracy theory that there was something less than 100% perfect with that last election.
It's amazing, yeah.
So the point I'm making here is that it's not just Georgia, but there are movements in many other states.
Arizona, too.
Oh, yeah, the Maricopa County. There's some real tough patriots there having a recount of 1.2 million ballots. In fact, I got Josh Bernstein coming on with me on Friday.
And it's a largely Hispanic county, too.
And it constitutes about 60% of the vote in that state. And there's some major questions about that. I mean, I don't have a lot of hope that that's going to be happening in an honest way because the powers that be out there are doing everything they can to stop it. And again, we're talking about very powerful, entrenched, corrupt people who are doing the bidding of some bigger corrupt people who have a lot of interest in making sure that nothing happens. But nevertheless, there is a movement, and it's very predictable, that state houses are taking back their prerogative. I mean, I'm writing about an average of one short book a month that deals with different issues. And my most recent one is How to Win an Election. in which I'm encouraging people like you and I, housewives, teenagers, retired people, empty nesters, anyone who has a little extra time in their hands, to run for state rep or state senator or even local city council or school
or town selectmen,
town board member,
committee.
and that you can win. And I get into in this book, it's a manual, how to do this. And I'm also offering my services as a consultant. If somebody wants to, I'll Zoom meet them for like a 90-minute meeting, very low cost, in which I'll go over with them a strategy for how they can win. I'll take a look at their race, their positions, how to present them, and I'll help them put together a blueprint for how to win their race. Because I do think that not only are they going to find that a lot of these races, there's someone in there who's probably been there for like a decade and no one even knows who they are.
That's correct.
Even if they live in the district, they've been unopposed. And you can take a look at who these people are and what their voting record is. And, these are winnable races. These are small races. And I'll use the example of Tip O'Neill, the late Tip O'Neill, right?
That's right. All
politics is local. When he first ran, he knocked on every single door in his district. And we're talking about a man who was a heavy drinker and he was obese. All right. So, he didn't have the health to do this, but he did it anyway.
Right.
It took him about a year. But he learned a lot from that, and this is why he won. And he did it with no money. The Kennedys were against him. He didn't. The machine didn't like him, but he won the thing with very little money. And if he can do it, I use that as an example. It can be done. So I'm hoping.
Well, Chuck, living here in Alton, New Hampshire, we just had our town election. Oh, by the way, before I mention that, I want to talk about Windham, New Hampshire, just for a few minutes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Hal, let's be careful with that. I brought this up on TikTok, and I had my TikTok banned.
Yeah. All right, then we won't mention that.
We can mention it by use of euphemisms. Okay.
Okay.
Even though what happened in Windham, New Hampshire was covered by the mainstream media. In New Hampshire, Jeff Cooner talked about it in Boston. WRKO, this is not. But apparently for big tech, this is too much.
It's too much. Well, anyway, be careful. We just had our town election a few weeks ago here. In most towns there, it's in March, and I come up here and I've hit the ground running. I've made a lot of good friends. I've known some people already. There's a gentleman that used to live in Boston, Jamaica Plain. I was his son's Sunday school teacher back in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. He came up here, semi-retired, and he ran for state rep, and he won. He said he didn't have any money, He said someone asked him if he'd run, and someone else who had been doing it, who was a state rep, did not want to run for re-election, and he won his election pretty handily. Yeah. And I'm in what is Belknap County. It's the most conservative county in the state. I think there are 20 state reps from the county, and all of them are Republicans. Now, I don't know if all of them are like 100%ers, but you drive around here and you still see a lot of Trump signs, where in Boston, not so many. In fact, you don't see too many Biden signs either. You saw more Black Lives Matter signs than you did Biden signs. But there was a town election, and one of the men who was he had been the selectman. He lost by 16 votes. So he lost by 20. They did a recount, and he lost by 16. And he said, it's just about voter turnout. If more of the people that liked him came out, and, I supported him financially. And he said, well, I'm going to run again next year. But if so-and-so isn't running, then I'm not going to, because they don't want to compete against good people. But I'm thinking about running maybe at some point for selectmen. And who knows, maybe state rep, although I think I can do more. They all say I can do more on the outside. Sure. I think as director of Camp Constitution, I like to think I'm influencing people and networking with people, which hopefully creating potential candidates, as opposed to, there's one thing I would hate to do, Chuck, is sit there through a hearing. You know how you're going to vote on the issue, but you got to go through 5 to 6 hours of hearings, because that's just the way it's done. That would be a little tough for me, but
no, I understand. But I would just point out that these offices, if there's one thing we learned from this last election, is that they hold enormous intrinsic powers that they have either forgotten about or that have been usurped by unelected bureaucracies, right, both nationally and internationally over a long period of time. This didn't just happen overnight. This has been going on probably since I would say that the watershed year was 1912, the election of Wilson. It was the first.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Ever since then, you've had the transfer of elected powers to unelected agencies on state, federal, and even international level. And if you run for these, and the ultimate proof right now is what happened with the election. I would suggest that if we have people who are aware of the actual powers of these offices, and that includes like city, school committee, all of them, going in and taking office and reasserting those sovereign powers in areas of election, of education, of healthcare, of welfare, of any other aspect of governance, then we are going to preserve our future. We're going to continue this great experiment of self-rule, because otherwise we're seeing those powers atrophy and die. And so I would suggest, and by the way, if you're like a Bernie Sanders guy, or you're on the far left, and that's what your community is about, fine. I support you too. I would help you run, because the point is a local office has to reflect the values of that local community, whatever they are. Mm-hmm. And you should assert those powers in your community in the purview of the office that you hold. So I'm hoping that as a reaction to this last catastrophe, we can have people wake up and begin to reassert our own self-government. I mean, that's what Donald Trump was all about. That if you look at his inaugural address, it is one of the best ever delivered by a president. Not that he lived up to it 100%, of course, but the idea of it, the spirit of it, represents the movement that he so ably launched. Whether you liked him or not, the point is that is what we're looking at right now, reasserting that, and it's been taken away temporarily. Anyway.
That's right. Well, I think it's the philosophy of America. You put the interests of America and the American people first. And that's why Trump was hated. Everybody loved him when he was the boss on that, what was that reality show, which I didn't care for. I'm not a big fan of reality shows. And he was a cameo appearance in a number of movies. Then he comes down the escalator and says, we got to secure our borders. Oh, you're a racist. I think maybe some of these international trading deals, we're always getting the the short end of the stick. I think we had that's why they hate him.
Of course it is.
That's why they hate him. That's why they hate anybody.
And by the way, speaking of which, I understand that. I think I mentioned this to you before, but I want to mention it. Tom Hartman is a left-wing talk show host I listen to occasionally. Mm-hmm. Classic, knee-jerk, goose-stepping, left-wing, everything is, goes through that sieve. And when he was criticizing Trump, one of his criticisms was that Trump's father was a secret member of the John Birch Society. Uh-huh. And I was like, wow, that tells me that Trump does know the score. He knows what's really going on. And, I think that I hope that was true. That tells us a lot. Anyway.
Well, when I used to cover New York for the John Birch Society, I used to get to New York City, about once a month, spend a week in the area, not necessarily the city, but the area. And I would ask about him. And some people knew him. They say, well, he's a patriot. He gives money to Hillary. But the wealthy businessmen tend to give money to all the candidates.
That's right.
In fact, this drug company this drugstore chain down in Florida, they gave Governor DeSantis so many thousands of dollars, but they also give money to Bernie Sanders. They gave money.
Sure. They're not political givers. They do it on all sides.
And, the auto dealer in Norwood, Ernie Bach, he was a big Trump supporter in 2016. Yeah. But I went on to he donated money to Bernie Sanders this year. So
they're not ideological givers. They give to whomever they think is going to win. Basically.
That's right. And they take it, well, hey, they're going to be, they'll give them a pass. They won't pass restrictive laws against their interests. That's just, I don't like it because I don't apologize for being an ideologue,
No, I know that, but that is how that works. It's a kind of corporate giving. They'll do whichever side they want to be on the winning side.
That's right. So. So anyway, but I want to mention too that this notion of Trump being a racist. If you go on YouTube, which is where you are, and you put in black conservatives for Trump, you're going to find dozens, if not hundreds, of very conservative patriots. There's a fellow out in California. He's known as MAGA Hulk. He's about, I don't know, 6'8" and built like a brick wall. He has the gentlest soul. And I mean, the way he speaks, he's leading the Recall Newsom campaign. And he was interviewed on Newsmax recently. You know, that's the kind of people you want in Congress. You want to get in Congress, you know. Here in Boston, we've got Rayla Campbell. She ran against Ayanna Pressley.
Sure, I've interviewed her. Mm-hmm.
You know, and so you've got a lot of people. So this idea of freedom is not something that's white. It's something that is universal.
Well, I actually think that not only did Trump officially do better amongst people of color in this last election, that's why even in Massachusetts, he did better in Boston by 2%. And he did very well in cities like Lawrence and Holyoke, where you have a large Hispanic population. But I think that if you took away, how should I say this, the improprieties, he did even better. Let's just say that, okay?
Yeah.
And that's his natural constituency, people of color, minorities, and young people. Anyway, so Hal, talk about the Camp Constitution, what you're up to over there.
Well, we're actually got a busy month. We were supposed to be in Ohio this week, but things didn't work. We weren't planning the events and being planned for us. They fell through. But this month we have a lot of events. We're bringing into the greater Boston area and up here in New Hampshire, a guy named Coach Dave Daubermeyer. He's got a ministry called Pass the Salt Ministries. He's like, you know, you've met Reverend Stevie Kraft.
Yep.
He's like Reverend Kraft with white skin. And we're going to be doing things. We're going to be doing some events. You can go to our calendar on our website and see some of the events. Of course, we have a ladies retreat now. We got a ladies group that meets. They're having a weekend event at our camp we lease the camp. We don't own it, at the Singing Hills Christian Camp and Conference Center in Plainfield, New Hampshire, which is just about an hour north and west of Concord. Beautiful venue. It's coming up from the 16th to the 18th. And, of course, our annual family camp, which is coming up July 18th to the 23rd at the Singing Hills Christian Camp. We have, among our guest instructors, we have, as I mentioned, Mary Grabar, the author of Debunking Howard's Zen. We have Jonathan Alexander, who is with Liberty Counsel. He's a young black attorney. He's in his early 30s. And he actually lived 2 doors down from me back. He grew up in West Roxbury. His dad is the pastor of a very large Haitian Baptist church in Rosendale. Mm-hmm. And he'll be talking about, he actually played a little bit of a role in this past election, in the wake of the election. He was in Harrisburg, so he'll be talking about his experiences. Then we have Pastor Dave Whitney, Institute on the Constitution. He's an expert on the jury system. He'll be and Alex Newman of the New American Magazine. In fact, it was the last book that Sam wrote.
Yeah, sure.
And Alex co-authored. Alex was there last year with his family. In fact, Sam said it. He said to me, "It's my swan song." Crimes of the Educators. Yeah,
that was amazing. In the late '80s, he's still there driving around. I think that his doing my show in Roxbury was one of his last public appearances.
That was probably his last. Yes, I think you're right. Yeah. And what's interesting is he told me years ago that he said, "I'm going to do this till I drop."
And did.
He's on his deathbed, literally. I visited him Thursday, but he died on a Monday. I visited him Thursday, and he's autographing his book, on his deathbed. I said, "This is amazing." Yeah, it was really something to see. And that's what I plan to do. I don't.
Me too.
What am I going to retire to? I'm not a big fan of golf. I'm sorry. I like to fish a little bit, but I'd rather do this than go fishing. Although I got plenty of lake. I'm right here in the Lakes region, so I can do some fishing now.
By the way, I should mention that Dr. Jerome Corsi was a regular of mine, and he did some great programming with me, and then he suddenly kind of disappeared for a while. He wasn't doing anything.
Yeah.
And I've contacted him, and he got back to me saying that he had promised I think he's in his probably late 80s. And
I met him. I spoke to him.
Not in the best of health. And he said that he promised his wife that he'd retire after the election. And so he's not doing anything right now, but he might still come back for a little something. We'll see. I mean, he's
That's good.
working on some business projects. And I mean, because people ask me all the time what's happened. So I think he's going to come back. We'll see. Anyway.
He actually mentioned Trump, and he said that Trump is aware of Gary Allen's writings, none dare call a conspiracy.
Oh, yeah, you bet. And also, Jerry Corsi stood up to Mueller and his brown shirts. I mean, they basically brought him in with a subpoena, and they said, "We want you to say X, Y, and Z." And he said, or else, you're going to you're going to do some hard time. And he's like, well, look, I feel like I'm at peace with my God. I'm at this age. I've had a great career. I am not going to buckle under now. If I have to go down, I'm going down, because I ain't going in. I'm not going to go with you.
Yeah, and do your worst. God bless him.
He stood up to them. And it was shortly after that their entire rotten Gestapo gang crumbled, because they couldn't get him to go on record as saying whatever the hell they wanted him to say.
Right.
And so he's a great man, in my opinion. He's written some amazing books. His book about the Kennedy assassination is one of the best. If you haven't read that.
I have not, no. I'll tell you what I just got in the mail yesterday. I'm almost halfway through it. Is Andy No's book on the Tifa.
Oh, yeah, I'm trying to reach him. I mean, I'd like to get him on. Talk about courage.
Too, because, I do a 30-minute show every week.
Great guy. Talk about courage. I mean, I think that they beat him to a pulp. I mean,
he got damaged pretty badly.
We're talking about a journalist. He wasn't particularly on the conservative. He's Asian, he's gay, he's liberal. He's not, the kind, not like a conservative guy. And he simply was doing his job.
He's not like Alan Stang, right?
There you go. Doing his job out there as a journalist. He probably got a degree in journalism. And he goes out there and talk about, the threats and the beating and it's amazing. It's an amazing story. And
he's Vietnamese, so he's Asian. You're not supposed to hate Asians. It's Stop Asian Hate. That's what you see all over.
That's the latest thing. We could talk. I noticed that one of my neighbors, I live in Boston, but I live near Brookline, and every day I take long walks. And I noticed that one of these Brookline people have replaced their Black Lives Matter sign with Asian Lives Matter. Which tells me that this is the new agenda. Not that, look, we could get into that, a whole different subject. Anyway, Hal, so I want to thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you. And our website is campconstitution.net, and then you can access the Blumenfeld archives as well.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me, Chuck.
All right, Hal Shurtleff. Right. Thanks a lot.